for another week. So just to remind everyone that this session is going to be recorded, and that our previous talks, which was Dr. Darren Stevens last week and myself the week before, they're available on our YouTube channel. So please like and subscribe there. And what we'll do is we'll put our contact details in the chat box. And then also, if anybody wants to put their contact details in the chat box as we're going through, then please feel free. So this week, our talk is with Chris Cooke. So welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Phil. Nice to be here with you all.
No, that's cool. And the talk is going to be on full spectrum emergence. So it's from soil to stomach to soul. So that sounds brilliant, especially as it's talking about stomachs. I'm hoping it's going to be talking about eating because I love food. So yeah, so can I ask, what is full spectrum human emergence, please?
Well, I'm glad you started to ask the questions, because when you said do the talk, I was thinking I needed to go alone. So I respond best to questions. So what is full spectrum emergence? It's a phrase that's emerged over the last 15, 20 years that describes what today we would call integral psychology. And basically what we're talking about is an understanding of the successional dynamics of the human mind, both from an individual perspective, from a collective perspective, and also from a species perspective. So it's quite a significant meta frame or meta space to hold that, as you rightly say, links, as I would describe it today, from the soil to the stomach to the soul. And the reason I use that little phrase at the end is to show that it's highly practical. And in terms of our practice, we cover everything from therapeutic practice, large-scale social change, through to the application in the regeneration of soil on the planet. So it's highly practical.
Oh, wow. Interesting. Good stuff. So where does it originate from?
Well, I suppose the science would originate back in the 1920s, but in terms of integral psychology specifically, I think we can spot the first signs of it being, of emerging with a scientific rigor in the 1970s. So the lineage that I work in originated with the first announcement of a point of view back in 1978 by Claire W. Graves. And that then grew into what today is known as the spiral dynamics integral lineage, which is an integral part of the work we do in full spectrum emergence. So it's got a very high level of primary research behind it, but obviously the more we do, the more we discover, so the research is still ongoing. So it's one of those never-ending quests.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. As a lot of things tend to be with science and everything, is you just keep learning and discovering more. So that's absolutely brilliant. So what is kind of the science about it, as we're talking about science there? What underpins this?
Well, it's not an easy question to answer, because I suppose the fundamental premise of science is to really seek the truth. And I think if I use the words of Howard Bloom, I love his phrase, because he said, look, we need to seek the truth based on what we observe in front of us, and we need to seek the truth as if our lives depended upon it. So there's an urgency, a rigor to science. But the differentiation I want to bring here is that whilst we've got that rigor, we've also got a shift in awareness to where the awareness is it's as if all life depended on what we're examining. So it starts to bring a much more holistic appreciation of humanness in the context of life on Earth, in the context of universe.
Right. Okay. Interesting. So it is all about, trying to find what I guess it's kind of, really trying to look deeper and trying to understand things and then see where things are going. Would you say is that kind of thing?
Yes, it's definitely stepping back and looking more at the patterns and the change dynamics over time. So it's much more process-aware appreciation. And obviously then, with an awareness of process, you can then drill down into a more conventional scientific mindset to actually get down to the details should you need it. So the two are complementary. But I think what we're living now and what's emerging is what I would call a more holistically oriented scientific appreciation. And I can track the origins of that back to the 1920s. One of the primary documents that really established this field was 1926, the work of Jan Smuts, and that was basically holism and evolution. A very, very substantive piece of work. And it was very influential in shaping a lot of the science at the time. So Jan Smuts was contemporary with Einstein and others who were really defining the science that's more generally being adopted today, which is the quantum sciences. So it's the thinking behind those quantum sciences. And certainly in the link to human potentialization, which is our interest this evening, it really shifts us into a conversation about the personology. It's the study of the whole being in the context of life as we know it. So it's a bio-psycho cultural social systems perspective that we're really talking about.
Wow, biopsycho. What was that? Biopsycho.
Cultural social systems perspective. Now, I've left out the spiritual component, but basically there's an underlying dynamic of change, which we might give all sorts of words, but that basically, when we go into humanness, is the consideration. Because certainly the research, and you heard it last week with Darren, that the importance of having an understanding of the biochemical, neurobiological signatures, as well as the particular patterns of the mind that we work with. But obviously we know that that's all shaped, and we shape the cultural and design the social systems that sustain what we believe to be true. And that's really the exciting piece of this work, is that it shows over the last 120,000 years how new truths emerged, decayed, new truths emerged, decayed, and we're in one of those transitions today, which is why potentialization is so important.
Absolutely. So that's fascinating, actually, to understand that kind of the history and the evolution of everything there. So, but what tools are available now to support this if people are interested in this?
Well, the primary tool in terms of assessment instruments that we use is currently called 5 Deep Vital Signs, but that's been embedded now in the Potentialisation Initiative. And this allows individuals to have the mirror held up to themselves or to the cultural collective to reveal patterns that the mind initially cannot self-inspect. And it's one of the challenges of the human mind. Once we become habituated and familiar with something, we tend to lose sight of some of the change dynamics. So these instruments hold the mirror up, and they're used in a wide range of contexts, from therapeutic right the way through to large-scale social change in communities. So we look at social as well as organizational change. And obviously the tools that go with that, it's the instruments themselves are part of a story, part of a patterning of the narrative of the individual or the collective. And with that goes a whole range of other tools and methods that have evolved basically since the mid-1970s. But what we're looking for is methods that are applicable across the full spectrum of our species without creating limitations. That's why I'm really keen on the language of the full spectrum emergence, because we've got such a wide diversity of humanness to consider. And the last thing we want to do is put in anything that actually accidentally or unintentionally creates a block to the natural motivational flow of an individual or a culture.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I love that full spectrum. Yeah, because interesting. I always think it's important to remember that as much as we are kind of all physically unique, we're also mentally unique. So it's a very wide spectrum. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Cool.
I tend to go a stage further than that, Phil. I say that we're all more unique than our fingerprints. And in terms of life on Earth, and I mean, I sometimes stretch it to a conversation to universe, but there's at this point in time, as we're having this call, there's no other being like you in the universe that's having this same experience. And so that means we can start to really pull out the uniqueness. And I believe that one of the key roles of our work together here is to move towards individualized support for potentialization that is radically different and builds upon everything we know and goes further.
Yeah, absolutely. Fascinating. Cool. So what is next, would you say, for the application for this with potentialisation?
Well, as I said, I think that the utilisation of the instruments in terms of our contribution, alongside with a full suite of information that I know John and the team are bringing in from a wide range of instruments, they will create new mappings. They will provide us with new understandings. It will affirm much of what we already know, but it will also highlight patterns that we ourselves have not yet observed, and that's the exciting thing for me. Certainly as a human species, we are not finished by a long way.
No.
And I want to make sure that we pick up on the fringes, some of the early signs of change. So as we go forward, it's really creating a meshing of these methods and understandings to create a more effective support for individuals, should they choose it, or should they require some support that really reflects who they are, not based on how they're perceived by or basically not how they're projected onto by a system that may or may not appreciate their uniqueness.
Absolutely, absolutely. Fascinating, yeah, because uniqueness is everything, really. If you can really capitalize on your uniqueness, then you can give your unique skills and talents and stuff like that. So brilliant.
Yes.
So,
yeah. And I suppose that in that uniqueness, what certainly we've been working with, I've been involved since '97, and what drew me to this was because I'm an engineer by background. I have to have stuff that works, and I realized that in some of the large-scale social change processes, the one aspect that wasn't being dealt with was the human change side of it, and that's what led to my interest, because I could always find that if one created the appropriate life conditions and found the right fit, you could completely outperform against the present paradigm. And that made me curious. But what I realized is that whilst there is uniqueness at a personology level, there are also some patterns and recursive patterns of the psyche that we need to be aware of. And some emerge, fade away, new ones emerge and fade away. And it's understanding those underlying schema that create the thema that really we're focused on. And obviously the thema means down to the design of your computer systems that carry with the design of these IT systems and the materials we use all carry the signature or patterns of the mindset that created them. So it's really enabling us to strip back and understand how we surround ourselves with these patterns and make sure we can choose to create our own unique life conditions that enable our thrival and release our motivational flow.
Wow, fascinating. So it's almost like you can't see an end to it. It's a continuous journey of discovery, basically. So that's wonderful.
Well, there's never a dull moment, and I think it doesn't matter which discipline you're in this, in this conversation. There's always something new to be discovered.
Yeah.
But for me, certainly, when I first came across the primary point of view that led to the work that we do today, and obviously I'm involved with the research and the development of this work, looking for the gaps. What struck me was how true it was to me. Now, obviously, you have to be careful when things like that happen. But what it highlighted was that there were aspects of humanness that are not included in many of the texts, and you have to delve into other domains, other disciplines, mathematicians, physicists, whatever. They start to identify some of these shifts in awareness.
Yeah.
And it takes a while for other fields, other disciplines to catch up. So it was the face validity and then the evidence that, actually the ease of application that was the other key feature, because I was really aware that the more elegantly simple the solutions, you could handle the complexity of a self-regenerating, self-recreating organism and self-organizing. You can actually work much more effectively with self and with others.
Oh, wow.
And so that's largely been the story ever since.
Oh, fascinating. So Can I just ask a little bit more about the soil to the stomach to the soul piece?
Okay.
So is that like different soil types, and then the foods that people eat, and then how that nourishes you as a person, or how does that piece fit together?
Well, it includes all of that, because the stomach links to health. Okay, so our psyche, our psychological flexibility, openness is largely a function of our health, a big component. And the link to soil and health, for me certainly, is because for us to demonstrate the efficacy of what we do, we always look for the new thinking that's emerging being applied in those domains. What I also realise is that, you know, as we get caught up in the narrative around climate change, whatever, we tend to always miss the primary wealth generating capability on the planet, which is primarily healthy soil. There is no civilization without healthy soil that can grow green plants. And what I've been doing is taking all these problem areas, or wicked problem areas, and looking for those individuals who found ways of working with natural systems and nature in ways that often lead them to being classed as heretics. That's always a sign of early adoption of new thinking, is a heretical attack. But basically using our point of view to assess the life conditions. If it's stressed, we know that human creativity will be being released, and we go in there and we look for the new minds that are being tracking how to work with the basic needs of humanity. And the greatest adventure I've been on now since 2008 is around the regeneration of soil, and looking for those and working with those who are involved with that. Interestingly, it's very much the same thinking as you find when you're dealing with the human psyche. So a lot of our linguistic structures around our understanding of change, we now transplant into the field of ecology, because they don't have those linguistic distinctions that are being developed around the point of view that we tend to focus on. And so this means it doesn't matter whether we're working with soil, the stomach, or the soul. We're working with the successional dynamics of life as it holistically evolves. So it co-evolves in a flow to generate and handle life as we know it today. And so it's the recovery. It's when you can start to recover natural systems and self-organizing systems that we know we're on the transition to the application of new thinking, and that's primarily the focus.
Oh, interesting. Fascinating. Cool. So if you were just to sum up then full spectrum emergence in a couple of words, how would you do that? And then we can go on to some questions from the audience if anybody's got any questions.
How would sum it up is with a question or an observation. If you want to get to what I believe the theory behind the theories and get to the root cause of human emergence, that's really what full spectrum emergence is about.
Right. Interesting. Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Fascinating.
Thank you.
So great. So has anybody in the audience got any questions for Chris at all on full spectrum human emergence?
Can I just say, I'm going to ask everybody to unmute, because they'll be mute, but it doesn't mean you have to, it just means you will be able to. So if you want to ask any questions.
Darren, you've got a question?
Yeah, I'd be interested in the research, that whatever the research is, if you're looking for gaps, I love looking for gaps. So I'd be happy to look over the research and see. Obviously, I'm going to be a little biased, because I'm probably going to look for the gaps from my theory perspective, but I will apply other psychological theories as well, to the best of my ability.
Yeah, one of the delights of following that curiosity, Darren, is that, as you know, as soon as it can be the story of myself or you, is as soon as we're going to offer critique, suddenly we find we're changing, because we're picking up the little nuances that we ourselves hadn't spotted before. Absolutely. So the original research started in the 1950s. It's a very extensive body of knowledge. But one of the challenges of this work is that in the early stages, the documentation isn't as robust as one would hope for. And that's largely because the original researcher was very independent, and basically for him, once he'd proved it, he didn't need to prove it to anybody else. But then, once it was announced in '78, the field trials were run in South Africa. And we're just at the stage now where the lineage of academics and theorists that were involved with those field trials are now coming to an end. But it's a fascinating study. And what I tend to find is that the main gaps, which I think you can contribute to, is certainly around that neurochemical, neurobiological relationships between particular stages of development and how those particular signatures change. So that's the area that I would suggest is the greatest need, basically to bring fresh validity to much of what we observe. So certainly in the domain of therapy and so on and so forth, working with recreational drugs of choice and their treatments, I don't think you can find anything better because there's an elegant simplicity. Because it's allowing us to create the life conditions that are half a step ahead of the individual, and they learn to grow into their new selves with grace and ease, and that's certainly a consistent pattern. So yeah, I look forward to that, and I think that is an essential premise of potentialization, to encourage that and to support that.
Well, if you think about it, from a spiral dynamics, it was used in South Africa to merge the cultures as best as it could. From a potentialization perspective, John and Phil, you've got a scale from individual to culture, of change, of adaptation, of complexity. This is being used at the cultural level, which is at pretty much one of the highest levels.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, in terms of our work on cultural scanning and so on, it's viewed to one of the leading practices today through third-party assessment. And it's, I think we just need to be cautious in that I think we're moving beyond the domain of saying we do anything to anybody. You know, the transitions in South Africa certainly were part of a natural cultural dynamic. And it was as though everything came together to collude to a peak. But obviously, we've seen how things have changed since then. And there are those who were, still active in South Africa. Many of the universities are involved, and so on, who basically are holding their hands up, wondering what else they can do. And that's largely, I believe, because if I visit South Africa and so on and so forth, whilst everyone had focused on the understanding of the stages and the attributes, that's really not what the theory is about. The attributes are the patterns left behind as the psyche reveals itself. What we're dealing with is an underlying dynamic of where the life conditions may stimulate new thinking or not, or whether new thinking can shift the life conditions or not, and how those are done in alignment in a way that maintains the flow and no one gets left behind. So certainly there's much to be done there to look back in, and I've just written a proposal this evening to look back in at the United States. We're surrounded by a whole raft of countries that are outgrowing their capacity to cope, and that's not just me saying that. These are the practitioners that come to me and say, we know there's something out there. We know something needs to change, but we don't know what. And what I'm suggesting is, look, like one government did, they wanted to understand the route to the second enlightenment. Well, the answer is easy. Unless you understand the underlying human dynamics of the first, you'll never, ever be able to go and create the life conditions for the second. And actually, the more you do, from a conventional perspective, you'll actually delay the onset of the very thing that you're looking for. So this is the wonderful place that we're in, of encouraging ourselves to look back in with a holistic awareness and learn to get out of the way. I think that fundamentally is the biggest lesson I've learned over these last 30 years. Julie.
I'm loving the phrases, and I'd like to have some sort of example to bring those to life for me. So I'm loving the phrases like patterns of the mind, that the mind can't see, and shifts in awareness, and self-organizing systems. Have you got some examples or stories that bring those to life as an abstract form? I can think. That sounds fascinating. What's some story or some example? Or
okay, I'll do my best. So really, the mapping that we're working with is a mapping of existential states, and
what are
that
they?
reveals itself in a multiplicity of ways. And the way it's tended to emerge from an integral perspective is looking at the observable aspects as well as the intangible aspects, and that's where it starts to become interesting. But these existential states have patterns. So if we go back to the San Bushmen in Africa, of which there are still a few, you're going back to a motivational state, which is purely physiological, purely reactive. Okay. If you then look for larger scale human engagement, so those groups would operate in mobs of 12, 15 family groupings would be the norm. The next organizational scale would be the 250s or so. There's one tribe on the planet today operated at 350 for since the 16th century, quite happily. And that shifts, the motivational state shifts to one of the need for assurance, and their practices and their thinking, their collective way of meaning assures safety. As we grow in scale, there's new patterns emerge. So from the physiological, through the assurance, through survival state, through security, through independence. And so you can hear the signature of independence in the American Constitution. The Declaration of Independence is a signature of a worldview that really does bring science to the fore. But what it brings into it is a dogma from the previous stage of development, which is not fully understood in the conventional sense. So you have a dogma with science, you get the scientism. So today, you get the transition from the one right way, the believers, true believers, the monotheistic beliefs, through to a flip to scientism and the atheistic perspective. But these are all patterns that very often we're unaware of until we hold those patterns up. And the next stage would be really humanistic, where the motivational state is one of affiliation, human bonding, and that then leads to communities that are aligned around values. But one of the patterns that changes in that transition is that it becomes an inner struggle that becomes the primary focus, not the external struggle of living. So those are some of the examples in what's called the first tier of this journey. So I know you've got another question there, Julie.
No, it's really interesting. It's just to explore a thought that it provoked in me. So I think I'm understanding what you're talking about, especially if you talk about from small tribes to countries, and then to say the European Union and the United States, what's next? Will we ever get to one world? And what kind of mindset would we have to see it as one world? 1 second before I go. And then it's like, I wonder if part of that paradox, obviously, is the apparent opposition of unity and diversity. But if we put that into a yin and yang thing, so dark with light together gives us the whole. If we said unity and diversity could be a yin and yang force, that seems to be, that might be what a lot of the challenge is, to be one world, is to accept, even more than accept, expect diversity, and then find at what level is it we have a unity, which of course, I suppose the unity is the planet. And maybe the ecological disaster could be a thing that got us to that if we don't see this as unity, then we're all destroyed. So we have to accept diversity. So that's what you're talking made me think.
Well, it's interesting because what you just outlined is really some of the signatures of the transition into what's called the second tier. And it's that second tier ability. I once had a Spanish student tell me, it's like standing on the balcony and looking back in at the whole of the human species. And that's where the quality of acceptance, the means value is acceptance. Really,
he'd have to be able to see himself as well to be the whole of the human. Yep.
Now the third stage, though,
again. Fascinating.
The whole. So the route to the whole really seems to be about appreciating process. and the mind functions differently from a humanistic to, let's call it, early stage integral perspective. And it's really the emergence of a holistic perspective. And the distinction we're making is that there's an early stage change which leads to a fully embodied appreciation of the whole, which we would call integral. Okay. Now in spiral dynamics, that tops out somewhere in what you would call turquoise. But the joy of existence and the reutilization, and this is where Darren will get interested, the reutilization of previous deep brain structures to provide the infrastructure or the schema that supports this new capacity, Julia, that you've spoken about. And it's that reversal, reutilization of deep brain structures and a complete reframing which characterizes the transition that you're getting a taste of. And it means that practically, from an individual, from a cultural, from a social perspective, one of the things that we have to really wake up to is that everything we believe to be true will have to be, is and will be re-examined. That's going to be the hardest challenge for us, to both handle the reality of multiple perspectives or multiple truths all operating simultaneously on the planet, whilst we also work out to how to fundamentally reframe our understanding of what good looks like. And this is why soil is so fascinating, going back to Phil's question, because one of the areas that I focused on was because of my discipline, let's call it that, of understanding that stress life conditions leads to human creativity and other aspects. I was involved with the 30-year drought in Australia. That ran until 2010. And I was called in year 15 because of some large-scale social issues that were causing problems around a city in Australia called Toowoomba. Now, it was the first time in a first world setting that any first world civilization had to say, we cannot grow this city anymore. So it was a very interesting case study. But as a byproduct of me being there, I began to find out from farmers how their conventional approaches meant that they could not sustain the growing of anything. But the argument from the innovators was, it's not shortage of rain. It's a whole new field that we're beginning to understand, which is the microbiome. Now, back in 2008, that was bleeding edge conversations. But it was also a great case study in helping those that were struggling with the rapid change in the life conditions to sustain the ability to grow food, largely because they were discovering that all the practices that they'd become trained in and attuned in terms of the chemicals, the ploughing, the disturbance of the fields, etc., were actually degrading those fields. Now, that means that every practice, but the bulk of practices taught in agricultural colleges today, actually degrade earth, degrade soil. So to change that, we have to fundamentally reappraise our understanding of that point of view. And that just gives you an example of the sort of thing I'm talking about when the reframing, the ability to accept, but also to learn to read nature's processes in new ways, which gives you a different metric. And I'm looking at Darren now. It gives you a leading indicator, more proactive approach to management, which is what I was hearing Darren talking about last week, in terms of if you understand what's next naturally, you can provide the necessary support and track those changes into the future. And that's fundamentally the leap that we're going through. Now, I think it's a number of years to grow into that appreciation of the whole or the all, but that's certainly a significant part of this work, is to understand that capability does emerge in our species. The early distinctions of I and you or I and we disappear, and the individual grows into an ability where they are simultaneously autonomous whilst also carry an innate appreciation of their embeddedness in the all. And that's a very interesting domain to operate in. And it is out there, but these individuals tend to be on the fringes because they tend not to be understood by mainstream society. Certainly in the transition into second tier, it's way beyond the capability of most organizational design structures and systems to even comprehend or work with them. Most of them either leave their organizations when it emerges, or the recruitment processes filter them out. And that's one of the sad things today, is there's so much latent capacity in our society that is not allowed to see the light of the day because it's not normal, based upon normal paradigm perspective of the thinking that got us into some of the problems in the first place. Now, we have to accept that and work with both. So Julie, that was a great question.
From a systemic change perspective, you need a person capable of thinking at that level to lead the movement, which is what you're saying. And they're not around, they're 5% of the population.
Yeah, it's a small percentage, but remember that nature's smart, okay? So as life conditions become more stressed, it creates an upstretch in the developmental processes of our species, or that's what's been the case so far. And certainly that's one of the things to look for in society. You know, the birthing patterns and so on and so forth. The next generation are thinking very differently, and many organizations today are struggling because they can't recruit even the youngsters that are on the planet today, because they're much more discerning. What's important to them is very different to what they've been socially inducted into. And that's where the tension comes, is can we release those latent capacities for the greater good, whilst also recognizing that there's 7.5 or 8 billion earthlings all going through this process of change, where all will need to coexist side by side on this planet. So that for me inspires the heck out of me as to how we address that. And I do think, Darren, it's really what you're looking for is thinking that's at least half a step ahead of normal change process. If it's in a therapeutic context where the individual might have quite severe issues to deal with, that's where you match them then head on. So understanding some of those distinctions becomes really important therapeutically.
Yeah, I wouldn't look at it in a therapy perspective. I'd look at it from a cognitive complexity perspective. And one of the questions I've got for you, if it's okay that I ask a question again, is do cultures regress? And I'm thinking specifically of America. Do they go down the scale?
Well, they can and they do. Basically, if you look back at history, there's over 20 civilizations that thought they were the bee's knees and disappeared. Yeah. But they all disappeared for the same reason, Phil. They all starved to death. Okay, they lost sight of their roots. Certainly in terms of the change process, the way I think of this now is that when an organism is stressed, becomes under stress, there's always a bit of an involution, an internal search, which basically, if you put into humanistic or into linguistic phrase, is, do I have the capacity to cope with this situation tucked away in the basement? Okay. Now, if they don't find that, you can find it, they can shutter down the stages. I did a big project in former coalfield areas, Julie, back in 98-99, to really understand what led to the situation after the closure of the coalfields. And the analysis was really exciting. What was even more exciting was working with third generation unemployed former coal miners who would come up to me and say, finally, I can brush the coal dust off my shoulders. Okay, so societies, individuals, groups can regress, evolve, but it tends to be in a way that allows them or equips them to cope based on those life conditions. Now, many people get a sense of that something's not right, but they've got sufficient energy and creativity to start to navigate a way through. But I'm not talking about early won or easily won change, but that can translate into a very evolutionary dynamic. And some of the patterns that we work with really understand the conditions for that evolutionary change process, so you can provide the individual with a mental compass, a mental construct to check out in which of these 6 domains am I perhaps out of alignment or need some attention. And so it's useful to support the mind until it's no longer, until these frameworks and structures are no longer needed. And so yes, cultures can regress. But we also need to remember that in those periods of regression, and it creates dissonance and turmoil, because for the observer, they've changed. You know, how many times do we hear it in couples and relationships? You're no longer the person I married. Well, that's probably true. But it means that it creates a new tension and new dissonance. And it's in that dissonance, the crucible, that the new thinking tends to emerge. And our challenge is to accept that and understand those patterns as Julia described them, to turn them into an opportunity for new ways, rather than slugging it out in conflict and competition and so on and so forth, which we're really good at. So I do believe that, you know, in our collective work around potentialisation, we're really part of the story, and with the greatest humility, we are part of the story, that where we learn as a species to move beyond the common strategy of common enemy or crisis to legitimize change, to a place where we can intentionally choose to change and really fulfill our role in the universe. You know, I do believe that nature has an underlying intelligence. I do not believe that there's a deterministic intelligence there, but I do believe that when you have 14 billion years of an emergent dynamic that leads to us having this conversation on this call, it needs to be taken seriously.
Choice was key for me there. Well done. Choice.
Good.
Fascinating. Any other questions from anyone?
If people aren't rushing, I've got a few comments which might lead to questions, perhaps. In terms of cultures going down the scale, I always look at Hurricane Katrina, that suddenly the infrastructure is destroyed, and suddenly you're watching people looting and various things, and it almost looks as if people have gone down to a very much lower survival level. So in extreme circumstances, that can happen quite quickly.
Yeah.
But of course, we were lucky that wasn't on a planetary scale, and we eventually get back in and fix those situations and get them working again. But people at most levels of awareness are simply trying to survive. And if the circumstances change, they have no choice but to try and survive in a different way. So opening that choice up will hopefully allow us to solve the world's current global problems consciously, because if we don't do it consciously, we might not do it fast enough to try and move forward to a bigger scale. I'm just thinking in terms of making things work in the future. One of the things I've always thought about for the new platform we're building is that, as well as helping everybody to become more self-aware and to improve, to be able to reach their potential, we also want to connect people together that are like-minded. At whatever level they are, it might be useful projects, community things, but the people that are perhaps waking up to a more global view of the world, we can connect those together as well. So I'm thinking we might get some really exciting conversations initiated because we're connecting more people together. And there aren't frameworks to do this at the moment. A really good example is that there's a new platform for chatting, basically, called Clubhouse. It's only on iPhone. It'll be Android again soon. And there's some really exciting conversations going in there, but it's completely random. And the people are creating groups all over the place. I would really love for our platform to be able to suggest who should go in there and have those meetings and what the common interests are, to try and give us some infrastructure. The way I think about the new platform is it hasn't got a specific agenda other than to help everybody to do what they were going to do and do it more effectively, to let what's going to happen emerge and emerge more effectively, as opposed to try and dictate any particular direction.
Yeah.
So Christopher's probably got comments on the things I've been saying, perhaps.
Well, it was just that latter one, that I believe that the platform and the work around it, I believe, enhances the individual's discernment of where to go, rather than to be drawn into what's just attractive. I think one of our challenges today, and I've just come off a call this evening, there's lots of fads out there which are apparently moving forward. There's new jargon and so on and so forth. But to equip an individual to be able to discern which is likely to be most beneficial for them, and also for the greater good of the role they play in society, that I think is our main opportunity, because we need to be able to get beyond the current narrative to address root cause. And when you start to address root cause, it opens up a whole world in which not only we're, the mutual explorers, but they're co-creating a narrative that supports the transition to a new paradigm. And it's that both and dynamic that I believe that it's both that we need to nurture and support, but understand the importance of the aspect I've just described.
And I see that Darren's put his Clubhouse in. One of the things we've been thinking about is, should we have a Clubhouse conversation later in the week after these calls for anybody that wants to do that in a more chatting sense, and maybe draw other people in from that platform as well.
What is a Clubhouse conversation?
It's just an app where people talk rather than video, things like this. They talk. It's been actually favored by Silicon Valley CEOs. You've got an elite group of these guys, and what they do is they use it to talk with each other informally. No one's recording it or anything like that, but they just chat. But you can do it obviously across countries, across the world. So it's like a Zoom call without the video.
Yeah.
But you do it on your phone. And I've been in a few recently, and they've been pretty good.
I like the video.
Me too.
Yeah, the video is very good for some people, but for others, they prefer without video. So
yeah,
it works really well for many people, and it's more inclusive that anybody that doesn't like the video, or it doesn't matter where you are, you could be in the car or whatever if you want to just join one of these. So it's not as formal. You can drop in and out of the groups and the chats much more easily.
And you can leave quietly. You don't have to worry about that kind of thing.
And they discourage it being recorded, specifically to try and make it free-flowing and people not worrying quite so much about what they're saying. So it's a really interesting idea. It's just I'm getting bombarded by invitations to join so many different rooms from the people I've followed that it becomes unstructured. So how would I choose the ones that are going to be most effective? And that's where I'm hoping our platform. Another one that's coming up as well is I've just joined, they've got a special offer, £20 for a whole year, something called Meow, where you join and then you can book sessions 24 hours a day, and you might connect with different people. You can choose from those times. It could be once a week, or you could do 4 or 5, and it automatically drops you into a video chat with 4 people at a time for an hour based on your interests. Again, a really useful idea, but again, no structure as to exactly who you'll end up with. And if you do enough of them, you might meet some like-minded people. But if we could just structure that a little bit better so that most of those conversations become much more meaningful and useful, I think we can accelerate everything.
Yeah. Chris.
I've got a question, if I may, Christopher. Thank you very much for a very stimulating set of ideas. I can't profess to be as well up on this particular subject, but I have the question I have is, can you point to any organizations or cultures or groups that seem to be ahead of the curve? I mean, you're describing an emergence of the next level, the next stage, and I'm quite interested. Do you see any examples where people are getting it, if that makes sense?
Where it's most prevalent, where it seems to be emerging.
Yeah, where should we be looking to?
Well, where you should be looking on is on the fringes, on the edges.
Okay.
It never emerges in the mainstream.
No.
But let's look at a national level.
Yeah.
There are certain countries that have reached a level of, let's call it, maturity where they know they need to change, but they're not quite sure what. So you look at the Scandinavian countries.
Yeah.
There's a very significant humanistic center of gravity that's emerged there. Japan is in an interesting situation as well. I would suggest that Japan actually was the leading edge of this new wave until the last 15 years. The Second World War, the nuclear bombs and so on really created a shock in that culture. So Japan, the Scandinavian countries, you'll find a similar signature. Switzerland as well is where they've learned to handle the ecological issues. But the issue that they're struggling with now is how to make the next transition beyond the norms that they've now created for themselves. And you tend to find the emotional cost of caring is the big signature. We hear conversations in this country about the excessive taxes and so on, but that's largely because culturally they've chosen to do that. I'd be watching Canada. The countries that successfully developed to where they are without too many revolutions, and that neglects the rest. But I'm just tracking, interestingly, you tend to find the quiet countries are on that cusp. So certainly in the domain of social activities, science, etc., it's definitely on the fringes, but it's definitely emerging. Certainly in academia, I'm very plugged into more independent scientific network because they've got more freedom, they don't have to conform, and that tends to be where a lot of the leading edge change, I think, will emerge.
It's interesting the countries that you mentioned, because many of them tend to be countries that come relatively high up these sort of gross national happiness indexes and things like this, for whatever you may think of those indexes. But it seems to be that whilst they're an oversimplification of what's going on, it is quite interesting that they're countries that seem to have a different cultural set of outlooks. Apart from the Japanese example, which I think that's had an existential shock, it was certainly within the last 2 generations. But it's quite interesting, again, I was reading something the other day about countries aligning more on these sort of different values rather than on economics or economic blocks or even geographic blocks, that they're more aligned. There's more in common with Iceland and New Zealand than there necessarily is with New Zealand and Australia or Iceland and Russia, even though they're geographically close, that in some way that their cultural psyche is different. To its local geographical or economic block than to its value system.
Yes. And obviously the key one, because I was been involved with some of these national level things, the capacity of your own language to navigate to new levels of awareness is a significant factor. When I advised on some of the work in Iceland, for example, and when we analyse the language, there is no language that extends into the stages that I was discussing with Julie. Okay, so that becomes a barrier. So we have to remember that languages, there is a genetic component to this as well. So many of the indigenous communities that we've worked with, it's downright cruel what we expect, because we don't fully appreciate just what they can offer, but we expect them just to be like us, to conform into a conventional first world economic model. And the language today and don't hear me as being critical, I'm just giving examples. When we get into the language of circularity, there's a massive truth in that. And we tend to get to the edge of the present paradigm through crisis or whatever, but then we legitimize, we rationalize to stay in the dominant narrative and dominant paradigm. So there's a lot of there's a lot of reaching a nexus, but then pulling back from the edge, because I think many individuals and many societies know that means radical change. Well, I worked with the investment community in agriculture, and I worked with a German placement group, an amazing company, you know, completely different to what you find in the marketplace. And they were working with a club of 32 institutional funders. I mean, these are the big pension funds. And out of those 32, it was a Danish pension fund that chose to invest in some work in Australia, which today would be, it's the leading edge conversation in terms of how do you regenerate land using livestock. And the head of the placement group came to me and said, Christopher, can you help? He said, because we're having difficulty helping this new thinking practice in Australia be understood by the Danes. And they use some of the full spectrum emergence conversation. And it's the first time in the investment community, once they could see it and understand how it benefited them as a pension fund, they flew to Australia, reviewed it, and they, after 3 days, they said, no, we cannot give you the money. And you can imagine the shock. But then, for the first time in the field of private equity, they said, no, we want to give you more. And it was 50% more than they'd asked for, because the managers out of the Danish pension fund had found something that helped them make sense and create meaning for themselves. And that led to an overinvestment compared to what the original asked, because it was so important. And that's the sort of potentialization that I'm looking for, is when the individual sees something fresh, goes that step further, and allows us all to grow into a new quality of life. And I think quality of life, Darren, is going to be one of the primary determinants of what we choose to do. But how often do we have the conversation about it? It's very rare.
Well, I teach students who are from all over the world, and I literally talk with them over the last 3 months, the last semester, basically. They live in India. They're doing their lecture on their mobile phone because that's all they've got. And it's fantastic. They're sharing PowerPoint presentations on their phone.
Yeah.
And, and doing the thing in front of all the other students in front of, or like this, like we are now. And they are inhibited. They are limited by their culture, their beliefs, and all these other things around them. Yet they're trying their best to educate themselves with an English degree. And it's that kind of thinking that's going to help India out of where it is right now.
Yeah. So, Chris, I hope we covered your question adequately.
Yeah, it's just a fascinating thing that what I was really behind it is that you need the beacons, you need the, where do I look for the future? I need to be able to see it in, even if it's emergent, even if it's very nascent. What am I looking for? One of the things that's most interesting, I thought you might have mentioned Bhutan, because Bhutan has shifted its view of what is important, and it's created this idea of, well, instead of simply measuring the nation, what it's important to it is, instead of GDP, it has got a measure of GHP, gross happiness product.
Right.
Now, what on the face of it, that could seem a little faddy. It could seem a little bit superficial. But actually, what they've more recently done is said, okay, that's fine for the people, but now what we're going to do is we're going to have one for organizations. So any organization that is a public organization within Bhutan, and okay, Bhutan's a small country, I appreciate that, but they are measured on this, and it has all the dimensions and things about, as things you talk about, the way, what is people's wellness at work? How is the organization working? What's its moral compass?
Yeah.
What's its ethical standpoint? And it uses both actual measures and proxy measures to try and arrive at this. And to me, it's quite an interesting development that you start with an idea, it becomes a beacon, that country then starts to be known for something, it then runs with the idea and goes even further. And it's just fascinating to me that you can, that again, you talk about outlier. You couldn't get much more of an outlier than Bhutan, really.
No.
You know, in terms of a country. And what's always fascinating to me is, where does it work? However small and however much of a glimmer there is, where is the acorn of possibility?
Yeah.
So so thank you for the answer. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think, Chris, what you remind me of is that in our work around potentialisation, I believe fervently that every country has got its own unique contribution to make to the future of the human species, and we just need to learn to spot what it is. And if gross national happiness as an index is Bhutan's contribution, the one thing I would say is that we need to be able to look back in at these situations and understand why it became important, why it became adopted in the first world. And one of the things I've not really spoken about this evening is that it's the assessment of the life conditions that leads to the particular way of thinking that we really need to understand. So I think there's much more in Bhutan than the gross national happiness conversation, because it's probably one of the first countries that achieved a level of economic stability when no one really needed to work. Now there's a whole range of analysis I think we could do here to look back in and look at the pathway of each country and see what hidden gems are out there. And I always look for the messages in the bottle that were planted about 100 years ago that we're still waiting to find. And so all those things I get excited about, and I'm really delighted to have a chance to talk to you about it all this evening.
So all those countries that were mentioned, is there an element of control, as in less control? The ones that are the happiest, the ones that are more progressive, ones that are thinking beyond their current legacy, is there an element of less control?
Well, I think there's an element of greater acceptance of role, which requires less control. The control's often there in all cultures, but it's how the individual, the popular, how the citizen perceives the situation. So I've done, 93, 94, 95. I ran a company in Southeast Asia, and so I was in Thailand, for example. And the first thing you learn down there is that there's a very distinct hierarchy in the culture, and everyone's happy, but it's because they can accept their roles and places. Whereas if you applied the same approach here, everyone would be totally disgruntled and rejecting hierarchy or whatever, and because it's the qualities of the population that determine the success of their culture. And I always smile because, sorry, Dan.
They call high context cultures, low context cultures.
That's right, yeah. And this is, there's no better or worse. It's just how reality is. But I always remember I was involved remember I've been doing this for a number of years, and I always remember in the studies of Bhutan when one of the Bhutanese described how they define their national border. They go on the mountain, they roll a boulder down, and where the boulder stops, that's the border today. And I just love it. And, we start to rigidly define, fiercely defended borders. But I think what we can say is that Bhutan thinks differently compared to what the rest of the world believes. And also, because of that different thinking, they become attractive because they have qualities and ways of engaging each other which are attractive to those who would argue their life is much more miserable. So it's going to be fun as we go forward with this.
Fascinating, absolutely fascinating. I'm going to have to read up more on Bhutan, I think. I've not really heard of it much before.
Oh, Bhutan. And,
good old Bhutan.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. Cool. So thank you very much for that. Has anybody got any further questions before we wrap up?
I'll just say I've just dropped a link in the chat that everybody can see. We've discovered a nice little tool called Linktree, and it lets you drop all of your links for various different things all in one place, which means you can just hand one link out So if you're ever looking for the link to the latest interview or the website or our Instagram, whatever it might be, they'll all be in there. And if I'm doing it properly, up to date with the latest link and everything else. So there it is. I'm not sure if that actually appears in the video when we record it, but I'll drop it in the comments. I'll read it out. It's just Linktree, but it's linktr.ee/POTX, short for potentialisation. So Linktree/POTX, and the E and E have got a dot before them to make it a valid link. So, yeah, you can follow us, Facebook, LinkedIn, all those different things. You'll find all of them in there.
Brilliant.
And also a link to Phil's details and mine, and the speaker that we've just had for the previous week. So you should find everything in there.
Good. Well, thank you. Thank you, John. Thank you, Phil. And thank you, everybody, for your great questions.
Thank you.
Brilliant. No, thank you very much, everyone. So, yeah, and we'll look forward. Is there one next week, John, or is next week, John, that might be Robin's talk?
Yeah, I think we might be missing a week next week because we've been juggling the different speakers. So I think it looks as if we're going to come back in 2 weeks with the next one, which will be
21st.
That's actually going to be you, Chris, isn't it? Chris Braithwaite. So in 2 weeks' time.
Oh, of course, yes. It's the 7th. Yeah. Okay, but I think of something to say then, wouldn't I?
Yeah, but I'm really looking forward to that, from the well-being and positive psychology.
Yeah.
So that's really exciting as well. So great.